Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Alan Alexander. I'm General Secretary of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and it's my very pleasant duty this evening to welcome you to this first joint lecture sponsored by the Royal Institute of Philosophy and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. My notes for this evening told me that if this was a success, this would become a regular event. The first test of success is the number we have out on a cold December evening, so I think we can assume that there will be more of these, and we will be delighted to cooperate with the Institute on that. The RSE, for those of you who don't know, is Scotland's National Academy. We have a fellowship of about 1,600 people covering all the arts, sciences, culture, broadcasting, journalism, everything that makes Scotland the country that it is. As I said at the beginning, this is a joint lecture sponsored by the Society and the Institute of Philosophy, and I'd now like to hand over to Professor John Haldane to introduce our speaker. John.
So I should explain that I'm one of the professors of philosophy at the University of St Andrews, a fellow of this society, but more to the point, currently chair of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. And I'd like to begin, if I may, by just saying a word or two about the Royal Institute and its activities. But may I say, it's a particular pleasure to have been able to effect this occasion of bringing together these two Royal Societies, Royal Institute, for this inaugural event. The Royal Institute of, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, you hardly need telling about it. It was founded in the 1780s, and I'm pleased to say that it had philosophers among its founding members, including the great Thomas Reid, a philosopher whose standing has risen considerably, really, in the last 30 or 40 years, as it's come to be appreciated, both what a profound and interesting philosopher he was, but the extent to which he anticipated many developments, including some developments that didn't really come to fruition until the 20th century. So philosophers are in at the start here in the Royal Society of Edinburgh. The Royal Institute of Philosophy is a somewhat more youthful organisation. It was founded in 1925 as the Institute of Philosophy, and people like Balfour, so there's a Scottish connection, Balfour, but Bertrand Russell and others were involved in establishing it. It became the Royal Institute of Philosophy in the period following the Second World War, and it said that this was a reward for it maintaining its programme of lectures through the period of the war, through the Blitz, so a little like the Windmill Theatre, it never closed. The Royal Institute today, by very happy coincidence actually, as I was coming in, I saw Lord Sutherland. Stuart, where are you? I'm not seeing you just now. There he is, yes. I saw Lord Sutherland. Stuart Sutherland is the current president of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. He was, of course, president of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Indeed, as we know, there are very few high offices that Stuart has not held at some point or another. In fact, many of them simultaneously. There can be very, very few people, I can tell you. In fact, uniquely, I would have thought, Vice-Chancellor of the University of London, Principal of the University of Edinburgh, Chief Inspector of Schools, and so on and so on. So delighted that the Sutherlands are with us this evening. And that is, as I say, a very happy presence because of Stuart's role in these two institutions. We also have with us the Director of the Royal Institute of Philosophy, Professor Anthony O'Hare, who's down here at the front. And please do have a look at the webpage and see some of the activities. It publishes a couple of journals. It hosts events of various sorts, but we've been venturing out in recent times, and we've now ventured north of the border. So the Royal Institute of Philosophy has landed in Scotland, and I'm very grateful to the Royal Society of Edinburgh for making that possible, and in particular, if I may, thank Una Carroll, who did a great deal of the organisational work for this event, so thank you very much for that. In thinking about whom we might have as the first lecture in what I hope will prove to be a series, we really couldn't have done better than have as our speaker Michael Ignatieff. Michael Ignatieff will be known to many of you, I think, perhaps from his broadcasting career at an earlier stage in his career here in Britain, both on television and on the radio. His career has been an extremely interesting one. There are very few people in the world who have combined an academic, a life of academic reflection and scholarship and research and so on, with a life of public affairs at the levels at which he has done. Michael Ignatieff is currently the Edward Murrow Professor of Practice in Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Initially a graduate of the University of Toronto, he then studied in Oxford under Isaiah Berlin, who was to be a major influence and focus of his own research. Thereafter, he completed a PhD at Harvard and began an academic career that's included positions at the universities of British Columbia, in his native Canada, King's College, Cambridge, and the universities of Oxford and of London, as well as at Harvard, to which he returned twice, first in 2000 and again more recently in 2013. In the intervening baker's dozen of years, Michael Ignatieff focused on urgent issues of international affairs, of foreign policy, war, terrorism, and nation building. Whether in considering the tragedies of Kosovo, Rwanda, 9/11, Iraq, or Iran, he combines in his writings attention to the empirical and historical facts on the one hand, with sensitivity to the values and loyalties that unite some and divide others. Also with great respect to the often conflicting appeals of moral idealism on the one hand and of political realism on the other. From the mid-1980s, he developed his career as a writer. He's the author of several novels, one of which was listed for the Booker Prize. He was, as I said, a well-known broadcaster, both on television and on radio. He had a series which some of you may remember, Blood and Belonging, which focused our thinking on issues of resurgent nationalism. His biography of Isaiah Berlin was based on conversations and interviews over several years, and it indicates, that text, the warmth and trust that its subject, Isaiah Berlin, felt for the biographer. Many philosophers, political theorists, and historians reflect on the business of politics, but few are called to it. Michael Ignatieff's calling was a literal one. When members of the Canadian Liberal Party visited him at Harvard, in one of his previous incarnations there, to ask him to return to Canada with a view to standing for Parliament and preparing himself for possible leadership of that party. In 2006, he was elected to the Canadian House of Commons, and 3 years later, he was ratified as his party's leader. His tenure, however, was a short one, ending in 2011, and last year, I think it was, he published a book about his life in Canadian politics and about contemporary politics more generally, somewhat ruefully entitled Fire and Ashes, Success and Failure in Politics. I've also heard him say in another context that, in the words of Hobbes, that his political career was nasty, brutish, and short. Well, now he is securely returned to academic life, and again reflecting deeply on the conflicts and compromises of idealism and realism. Like Berlin, he recognizes a fundamental plurality of values and thereby the permanent possibility of moral dilemmas. I should say, by the way, that he's joined this evening by his wife Susanna, and we're delighted to welcome her also back to Edinburgh. So today, however, he's not, I think, going to be speaking about moral dilemmas, at least not directly, but he's going to be speaking under the title of Liberal Democracy and the Challenge of Authoritarian Capitalism. Please welcome Michael Ignatieff.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Alan Alexander, to John Haldane. John welcomed my wife and I to St. Andrews and was a wonderful host there. And I want to thank Professor O'Hare for being here. I have a semi-idolatrous relation to the Scottish Enlightenment. Because for 6 years when I was a fellow at King's Cambridge, I was the co-leader of a project on the history of the Scottish Enlightenment, and so advanced is my idolatry that I spent the better part of this morning with my wife going from bookshop to bookshop in Edinburgh, and you have some spectacularly good used bookstores looking for a copy of Adam Ferguson's Origins of Civil Society, which I was unable to find, so if anybody has a copy, and could be very kind of you.
A first edition.
Nothing but a first edition will do, of course. So it means a great deal to me to give this lecture here, is I guess what I'm trying to tell you. It means a great deal. I know the room I'm in. I know the traditions of this place. They have formed and shaped me. I feel also passingly fraudulent in the sense that I'm not a philosopher. I'm a historian of ideas. That's about as close as I come. But it means a great deal to me to be invited by the Royal Institute of Philosophy and by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. The Royal Society of Edinburgh has just rendered me speechless by giving me a facsimile edition of David Hume's autobiography, which is the proudest possession of this wonderful institution. And I've just been given a facsimile and shall be reading it later this evening after a wee dram. So there we go. My subject is liberal democracy and the challenge of authoritarian capitalism. I'm absolutely delighted you're here. The philosophical content of this talk, which is mostly a talk about contemporary politics, mostly a talk about Russia and China, but the philosophical content of it is about the divisibility of freedom. What I will be saying to you is that this kind of authoritarian capitalism practiced in China and Russia is attempting an experiment in dividing freedom, that is, allowing capitalist freedom, but not the public freedoms that we usually think go with private freedoms. And a lot of the 21st century, the history of it, it seems to me, will turn on the question of whether freedom can be divided in this way, whether private freedom and public freedom can be split and divorced from each other. That's essentially what I want to leave you thinking about, and why I hope I pass the bar of addressing a philosophical question. There we are. And let me start by going back to 1989. I think many of us fell prey to what could be called the Fukuyama illusion, the idea that history had been leading in a certain direction, that history, to quote Herzen, had a libretto, and that libretto was a song of freedom, and that capitalist freedom would soon be followed by political freedom, and that the freedom that had been the preserve of the Western world until 1989 would soon spread around the world. And that was an illusion. We quickly saw that democratization did spread. This is not all bad news. Latin America is a transformed continent from what it was in the 70s and 80s. There are functioning democracies in Africa. Ghana would be a good example. There has been the consolidation of representative democracy in Poland and the Czech Republic. I don't want you going into the night feeling gloomy. There are many stories in which democracy has developed and taken hold, but the thing I want you to focus on is the ways in which liberal democracy has a new competitor. Authoritarian in politics, capitalist in economics, nationalist in ideology. China and Russia are not the first examples of what could be called authoritarian capitalism or authoritarian modernization. Those of you who do comparative politics will know that South Korea from the 50s right through the 70s combined high degrees of authoritarianism with rapid capitalist growth. Those of you who remember the 70s will remember the bitter experience in which Pinochet's dictatorship was combined with Friedman's Chicago School economics. So we have been here before, but I think we've never had an authoritarian capitalism which is a globally significant challenger to the realm of liberal democracy. And my question here is whether these regimes are stable and whether these regimes are expansionist, and how we in liberal democratic societies should respond to the challenge. I think what is unexpected about what happened after 1989, but in retrospect seems less surprising, is that the communist elites in these societies engaged in an extremely agile struggle for survival. From totalitarian methods of political control, they went to authoritarian methods of political control, and I'll spell out that distinction in greater detail in a while. One of the most significant changes in these, both the Chinese and Russian regimes, is the move from autarky, A-U-T-A-R-K-Y, for those of you taking notes, from autarky to globalization. To a degree that I think we forget, the communist regimes post-1945 to 1989 were autarchical regimes bent on an economic ideal of creating socialism in one country and avoiding implication or dependency on the capitalist system. These are regimes, and this seems to me the crucial move they made, have replaced autarky with an embrace of globalization. And they've gone from socialist central planning to certain varieties of state capitalism, kleptocratic capitalism, crony capitalism, authoritarian capitalism, but they've discarded socialist central planning. And they've replaced the overarching ideology of communism, the Weltanschauung of communism, the eschatology of communism, that is the idea that history is leading towards socialist fraternity and the world will eventually follow the path of communism. They've replaced that with something very different, which is regime-specific kinds of nationalism. So let me look at each of those moves in turn a little bit and put some flesh on the bones. I'm fascinated by these, by China and Russia as economic systems. It seems fascinating to me that they've replaced autarky with integration into the global economy. Their commodities and their products are priced on the global market. They're import and trade dependent. Fascinatingly, their fiscal sovereignty is constrained by global exchange rates and global commodity prices. And as you came to this lecture tonight, you could see what that means. Ruble halved in value, massive amounts of capital flight. These are authoritarian regimes that are trying to maintain authoritarian control in conditions of extreme globalized volatility. It's on the front page of every newspaper, and we simply don't know how this is going to turn out. They are also extremely dependent on global capital markets. And part of the ruble's plunge has to do with the urgency with which the Russian middle class and what used to be called the oligarchs are shipping money into dollar accounts in Western banks as fast as they can possibly do so. And that sets up a very important tension between authoritarian political control and control of your economy. And so we're living through an extremely fascinating test case as to whether the authoritarian capitalism that I'm talking about is as stable as a man like Putin assumes it to be. And if there's a source of instability, it has to do with the fact that you've gone from autarky to globalization. It's a very particular kind of capitalism, to just continue the economic thought for a minute. I call it regime capitalism. Other people call it kleptocratic capitalism. This is a kind of capitalism where the regime privatized assets to its political supporters in the 90s, where the regime determines who wins in capitalist economic competition. There is capitalism, there is competition, but the regime is constantly putting its thumb on the scale to determine who wins and who loses. It is also a regime that perpetuates a deep degree of instability in the capitalist system because it recurrently confiscates private assets and criminalizes competitors. And the reason it does so is to maintain control. The logic of this system is a kind of lawless capitalism that prevents regime competitors and creates regime loyalists. The system, the economic system, is run to inhibit the possibility of a competitor, an economic competitor, and then to reward loyalty. So it's a capitalist system serving essentially the political goals of regime survival and regime perpetuation. And that raises issues. I've talked a little bit about the economics, I've talked a little bit about the regime type. Let me talk a little bit about what kind of law is involved here, because it seems to me the way to think about these regimes is that it's rule by law as opposed to rule of law. Let me explain that distinction. Rule of law is something that we know a little bit about. An independent judiciary, constitutionalized rights, public trials, one law for party and people alike, one law for all, no retrospectivity in law. I think we all have a deep natural sense of what rule of law is. These are systems that do not have rule of law for the very good reason that any system that has rule of law has to allow some form of independent competition to its authority. An independent court, an independent press, an independent juries. That is incompatible with regime survival. So what you get both in China and in Russia is rule by law, that is, regular administrative rules that stabilize expectation and acquisition. You can't have any kind of capitalist system unless you have some expectation of procedural regularity and therefore some security of property. You can make transactions and you can make them stick. That's what rule by law means. But it's very deliberately not rule of law because to a degree that I think we've forgotten in the liberal democratic West, any system that has rule of law is a direct challenge to authoritarian single-party rule. So it's a system because it does not have rule of law. All political systems, without exception, liberal democracy, authoritarian capitalism, all of them, as we know very well in our own societies, are challenged by corruption. But the thing about liberal democratic capitalism is that it has cleansing mechanisms. It has an independent judiciary. It has a free press. It has throw the rascals out every 4 years if only to get some new rascals. This is how liberal democracies cleanse and fight the problem of corruption. Authoritarian capitalism has no regularized cleansing systems, and therefore corruption can in fact become very corrosive to its legitimacy. And it's no accident, therefore, that when Xi Jinping, the new president of China, chairman of the party, took power last year, his first objective was an attack on corruption, because he understands that this is regime dangerous. This is what can bring a regime down. If you don't have rule of law and you have rule by law, and if every transaction your growing middle class feels their property is not secure and that a regime loyalist will always get ahead in any economic transaction, that can build up systemic rage, resentment, and instability. He's waging a war on corruption that is simultaneously a war on his rivals within the party. Putin has institutionalized corruption. There is well-founded evidence to the effect that he's worth personally $50–60 billion. Staggering expropriation of state resources to his supporters and to his own pocket. But the vulnerability here is that if you have millions of middle-class Russians who feel the game is systemically rigged all the time, what does someone do in that situation? You put your money in a foreign bank as quickly as you can. One of the ways possibly to interpret capital flight, the collapse of the ruble, is simply one of the economic consequences of a fear that systematized corruption renders your own property, your own assets, your own bank accounts insecure. And so as we look at this, you begin to see some of the ways in which authoritarian capitalism has systemic vulnerabilities. So I've talked a little bit about what kind of economics we're looking at. I've talked a little bit about what kind of system of law we're talking about. I've identified a few vulnerabilities in the system. Let me talk a little bit about authoritarian capitalism as a system of politics. In China, the party regulates inter-elite competition and recruitment. One of the key aspects of this, the Chinese regime's legitimacy, is a sense that we don't have multi-party democracy, we don't have democracy, but what we do have as a source of legitimacy is very careful recruitment. One of the key sources of legitimacy for the Chinese regime is the claim you'll be a poor son of a peasant or daughter of a peasant from rural China, but if you show ability and go to the party school, you will secure promotion and can eventually become a senior party cadre. That is, the single party rule is legitimized as meritocracy, right? That's what they're trying to do. In the Russian system, Putin doesn't make much claim that his political party is a meritocracy. It's so obviously a band of robbers that doesn't try that. What Putin has put in place as a source of legitimacy is a kind of what I would call a Potemkin pluralism. You know about Catherine the Great and Potemkin villages that were just cardboard fronts that she drove by and said, what wonderful villages, and she believed they were villages and they weren't villages. There's a certain Potemkin pluralism in the way in which Putin manages his politics. There are political parties in Russia. They do compete. They have no possibility of winning. But that kind of pluralism is his alternative to the meritocratic principle of legitimacy that you see in Chinese politics. How do these regimes maintain control? I mean, first of all, they have to deliver certain economic goods. They've delivered growth above 3%. Their continued legitimacy and strength depends on the growth machine going. They are on a bicycle that has to keep turning. If they begin to slow down, the bicycle begins to wobble. And both regimes are having now some difficulty generating economic growth. Historically, it's, I think, very important not to neglect the claim that they make that they have provided stability. I think we forget that between 1964 and 1976, China was in effectively an inter-party civil war. Xi Jinping himself, as a teenager, was sent to rural China as punishment because his own parents were punished in the Cultural Revolution. So the promise, the delivery of stability is enormously resonant for a generation that remembers the trauma of civil war. In Russia, the same promise of stability is resonant for a generation that experienced the Putin years as a disastrous loss of prestige, a disastrous loss of entitlements, a chaotic breakup of a great empire. The stability promise made by both of these regimes is crucial to their popular support and legitimacy. Those are the positives. They deliver growth and they deliver stability. Occasionally they deliver competence. I won't overdo that. The negative side, from our point of view, is that they cultivate and exploit nationalist resentment. They systematically marginalize and criminalize civil society. They outlaw dissent and they silence the press. But they are not, and this is, I think, an important aspect about them that makes them so interesting, they're not totalitarian regimes. They're repressive regimes, but not totalitarian regimes. When I talk to my students about the human rights of China and and Russia. Many of my students are surprised at the number of political prisoners in Russia and the number of political prisoners in China. My students say the numbers must be six figures. They're not. In Russia, there may be a couple of hundred political prisoners, explicitly political prisoners. In China, possibly several thousand. It's not a regime that needs to do the totalitarian imprisonment for political belief that these regimes knew between, in the Chinese case, between 1949 and 1989, and the Russians knew between 1917 and 1989. Mass imprisonment, gulags, concentration camps. This is not to say they aren't extremely nasty regimes, but what's interesting is that nastiness varies historically. Nastiness is different. It's not always the same nastiness. Press control, for example. There's a nominally free press and a very courageous free press in Russia. What we know, for example, about Russian corruption, we owe very much to courageous Russian journalists. But how do you keep them under control? Two things. You sell the former apparatus of state media off to your cronies, and therefore you privatize. You learn essentially from Rupert Murdoch that some of the most effective control of the press happens through private ownership. And you do that, so you borrow from the West. And then, occasionally, you shoot a journalist. Occasionally. Not very often, but every couple of years you shoot someone in the back of the head. So I don't want you to mishear me. These are very brutal regimes, but their brutality is of a different kind than the brutality of Stalin, the brutality of Mao. But if you want to understand how this regime works, just think about Anna Politkovskaya. Think about coming home after a hard day's work, denouncing this regime, climbing up the stairs and being shot in the back of the head by somebody with a silencer. And to this day, this is the other aspect of these regimes, they're deeply aligned with criminal mafia. So the deep state, you can't even actually say it was Putin. Putin passes the word through his secret police to members of the Chechen mafia. They send the guy with the silencer. The deep state then gets him out of the country. Everybody's hands are clean. This is the structure of modern authoritarianism, and we need to understand its specifics. And this leads, I think, to the next point, which is for millions of ordinary Russians and Chinese. I now get to my fundamental point about the divisibility of freedom. Because the authoritarianism is so selective, so occasional, so liminal, so at the edge of awareness, most ordinary Russians have a feeling that they live in an infinitely freer society than they grew up in the 70s and 80s. Moreover, they are free to travel. I think one of the most happiest signs of a new world after 1989 for me was going with my wife to a vacation in a warm place. This was about 1990, and seeing some very, very large persons with very large bathing caps on, frolicking in this warm place. And I realized with astonishment these were Russians. This is a wonderful thing. Russians free to travel for the first time since 1945. That freedom is a crucial human gain, but it's a private freedom. You're free to travel, you're free to hold property, free to transfer property, free to accumulate a dacha in the woods, free to complain in private, free to drink as much vodka you want and say how awful Mr. Putin is. But you also live in a world in which you have none of the public freedoms, freedom of voice, freedom of participation, freedom of association, freedom to demand accountability of your rulers. And so this is the core philosophical gamble these regimes are making, that you can sever freedom to own, that is freedom of property, freedom to travel, freedom to exit and return, those private freedoms from the public freedoms of voice, participation, and association. And in a sense, the regime is saying, we'll give you one if you sacrifice the other. This is the regime bargain. Freedom is divisible. We'll give you half of the package, not all of it. And you don't want the full package because it'll blow the place up. That's the other thing. You're willing to make this trade because it gives you stability. We leave you alone, and we give you stability. We steal from you, and you keep your mouth shut. And this then, I think, produces, if freedom then becomes divisible, it then has, I think, a psychic consequence, which we're just beginning to measure, and which you notice when you talk to Russians and also Chinese citizens, and when you teach Chinese students, as many of us do, a kind of divided self begins to take place. When freedom is divided, selves divide. In the communist era, there was that kind of divided self. It was, you pretend to pay me and we pretend to work. In the authoritarian era, the division is more subtle. We have to work because we're in a capitalist society, so that we can't pretend to work anymore. But in an authoritarian capitalist society, you pretend to tell us the truth, and we pretend to believe you. And this inner division can be quite, I think, ultimately corrosive. That is, you know the public world is a sham. The public world is an area of highly manipulated performance art, and so you retreat to the private realm where you have some degree of authentic life. And this is the consequence of splitting freedom in this way. When freedom becomes divisible, lives and selves diverge. I've tried to describe the regime a bit, and I think I now want to begin to shift towards the second part of my talk, which is what we in liberal democracies ought to make of these new regimes. I think it's useful for us to shed certain illusions. That would be the first thing. Let's decontaminate our minds of certain happy stories we told ourselves. I think we believed after 1989, and the we here is maybe me projected onto you. You may not have believed it, but I certainly did. A myth of convergence, the myth that capitalist values and democratic values are inseparable in one. That is, the idea that freedom is one thing, that freedom cannot be stably divided. The myth that accompanied that was that as global economic interdependence advances, it creates a globalized middle class whose values begin to converge. So we're in the same departure lounge with the Russians and the Chinese, and if you're in the same departure lounge, you kind of think you're in the same world and heading to the same destination. In fact, they were heading to a very different destination. I think there was a certain amount of hubris connected with the myth of convergence, the idea that they would all become steadily more like us. It seems to me to be absolutely false and an interesting wake-up call for us. In fact, what seems so fascinating about globalization is that globalization has helped regimes hold power, helped authoritarian regimes hold power by offering economic freedom without political freedom. I mean, I guess one of the things I'm trying to help you see is that globalization stabilized an authoritarian alternative to liberal capitalism. And that seems to me a surprise. We thought that globalization would stabilize liberal democracy as a global project. In fact, it stabilized an alternative to the liberal democratic project. Capitalist globalization enabled authoritarianism. Private market freedom gave a rising middle class a stake in an authoritarian status quo. They have a stake in order and are willing to choose stability over freedom. And those who do want public freedom, and there's no shortage of people, passionate people desiring freedom, as we know when we looked at the young students in Hong Kong this autumn, there are no shortage of people who want freedom and believe that freedom should be indivisible. There are lots of them in Hong Kong, and there were lots of them in Moscow in 2012, but these regimes have proved extremely adept at throwing a kind of bell jar over these protesters, so that a bell jar is placed over the Hong Kong demonstrators, and most of China doesn't even know it's happening. You throw a bell jar over Moscow, and Putin makes the calculation, I don't care what they think about me in Moscow. What matters is what they think about me in Kazan and Vladivostok, and it is 9 hours further. It's in a 9-hour different time zone. The country is so big that you can literally lose a capital and lose its middle class and hold the rest. And so these are the strategies of survival of these kinds of regimes. Another way to talk about the wake-up call these authoritarian capitalist regimes has given us is that I think it's awakened us from the myth of one world, the myth that the globalization of technology and markets would produce shared worlds of information. I mean, in some of our most optimistic visions of the internet, for example, we thought we'd have global information commons, global public goods. We even went so far as to believe that conflict might abate because we would share the same basic stock of information and facts about the world. A kind of rationalist optimism took hold of me, I think, the idea that once these totalitarian regimes broke down with their information control, free information would flow into these societies, and some of the hostility, some of the nationalist hostility, some of the suspicion would abate because we would simply share a common informational world. And I think we've discovered everywhere that the internet does not produce a global information commons. Authoritarian regimes of the kind I'm describing have renationalized the internet, often with the collusion of the big capitalist internet providers, and sometimes with the collusion of democratic ones. The pipe can be turned on and off. It's taken us a while to realize how completely authoritarian regimes can reassert information control. Not just in Russia, not just in China, but just, when it gets hot in Egypt, they turn off the tap. And the tweets go to zero, the Facebook images go to zero, the internet goes to zero, and you put the tanks in the street and I think we didn't expect that the internet could be so easily renationalized. And the consequence is the reemergence of what I would call information autarky. We have a globalized economy with information autarky. We live in highly nationalized pools of information that are in some ways nearly as isolated from each other as they were in the Cold War. And when an authoritarian capitalist system can reproduce information autarky, it can reproduce its own reality. And when it can reproduce its own reality, it reproduces its own legitimacy. So those are some of the things that, in a preliminary way, I think we need to rethink as we look at what these new regimes tell us about the world of globalization. They, on their side, have a whole set of myths, some of which are actively dangerous. The myths I've described, myth of one world and myth of convergence, are merely kind of fatuous and innocent rationalism. The myths I'm about to talk about are a little more dangerous because they may have aggressive consequences. Both China and Russia have, to varying degrees, a myth of encirclement. NATO is trying to encircle Russia. That's a very common view. There's some truth to it, but it misses one crucial fact about the last 25 years that deserves reinforcing, which is NATO expanded to the Russian border because Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, and the states that gained NATO membership, particularly the Baltics, could not consolidate democratic freedom without it. The story that NATO has threatened Russia by expanding, that is, that the push forces are determinant, neglects the extraordinarily important pull factors from Eastern Europe. We can't be free, we can't be stable, we can't be democratic unless we have an Article 5 guarantee from NATO. So it's not encirclement, it's making sure that liberal democracy is consolidated on the Russian frontier. A similar myth of encirclement is very visible in certain aspects of Chinese foreign policy. U.S. and its allies are trying to encircle China in East Asia. Again, there is a push factor since 1945. Yes, the U.S. fleets are there, but it's also important to emphasize that, South Korea, the Philippines, Japan, even Vietnam want and are seeking counterpower to protect them from their hegemonic neighbor, China. So there's a myth of encirclement. In fact, when you look closely in East Asia, there are allies demanding protection. The difficulty about a myth of encirclement is that it becomes a myth of victimhood. Myths of victimhood then can easily justify aggression. Allied to the myth of encirclement and the myth of victimhood is a strong recrudescence both in China and in Russia of a certain kind of nationalism. China has returned big time to Confucianism, refurbished the imperial tradition of the meritocratic bureaucracy. One of the 7 no's in current Chinese ideology, one of the 7 no's, one of the 7 things that is condemned is universal values. In Russia, the nationalism takes the form of the truly astonishing spectacle as the grandson of a Russian Orthodox believer of an ex-secret security hood like Putin lighting a candle in a Russian Orthodox church. There's some forms of chutzpah that just render me speechless, and that's one of them, but clearly a use of the Russian Orthodox tradition, which has always been slavishly obedient to state power under the czars, under Stalin, and now under a secret police thug. That is a refurbishment of a kind of nationalist exceptionalism as the new mot d'ordre in the Putin Putin doctrine that has led to the expansion in Crimea and Ukraine. And the religious theme here is extremely important. St. Vladimir steps ashore in the Crimea. Some of the earliest monasteries in Russian Orthodoxy are on what is now Ukrainian soil. And so the refurbishment of Russian Orthodoxy as the handmaiden of the nationalist authoritarian state is, I think, one of its consequences has been the operation in the Ukraine. And it's important to notice what a transformation that is of our understanding of the post-'89 world. One of the things that the late and unlamented Boris Yeltsin did accept was that the republic borders of the Soviet Union should now become, post-91, the international borders of free and independent states. Yeltsin and the Democrats accepted that, and that meant the loss of Ukraine. There is convincing evidence that one of the things that marked Putin off from Yeltsin was a refusal to accept the legitimacy of the internal borders of the Soviet republics as international borders. One of the ways to think about Putin is that Putin is not just Putin, but he's part of a deep state, a security architecture that survived the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'm now going to make an extremely offensive comparison. I don't like this, but I simply can't resist it. The house burns down and only the cockroaches are left. In this case, the cockroaches are the deep state. In the foundations of the Soviet system, there are the people who were the secret police, the torturers, the poisoners. This is where Putin comes from, and that cadre never accepted the dismantling of the Soviet Empire and therefore the recognition of international borders. And the Putin strategy from 1990 onward has been to contest that international settlement that accepts those borders, and the chief target, but possibly not the only target, is Ukraine. Along with that ideology, a nationalist ideology with religious roots that does not accept the dismantling of the Soviet Empire, is a sphere of interest, a sphere of influence doctrine. The idea that it's worth noticing that sphere of influence seems like an anodyne proposition if you are anywhere aware from Russian or Chinese borders or American borders, but sphere of influence effectively implies that the sovereignty of everyone within a sphere of influence is relative. The sovereignty of the Baltics, the sovereignty of Ukraine, the sovereignty of Belarus, the sovereignty of all these states. If you accept the Putin definition of a sphere of influence, then you're conceding the relativity, the conditionality of the sovereignty of everybody who lives around these borders. And not for nothing do those states aggressively and angrily reject that idea of a sphere of influence. Putin's actions in Crimea and Ukraine are simply designed to make the full achievement of Ukrainian sovereignty impossible, to make it impossible for Ukraine to join NATO, and make it impossible for Ukraine to take a European path. That is simply to constrain the sovereignty of Ukraine. Now, I've put Russia and China, I've put them together in ways that overstates the complementarity, the similarity between these regime types. And I think it's important not to overdo that. I'm not telling you that we're looking at a new Russia-China alliance that will be stable through the 20th century and constitutes a geostrategic threat that requires us all to go out of this room tonight with our hair on fire. I'm not saying that. Russia is clearly the junior partner. China is the rising power. There is complementarity of economic interest. China needs Russian oil and gas, but notice when they do the deal on the price, who sets the price? China sets the price, not Russia. Russia is clearly the minor partner. Russia needs China a great deal more than China needs Russia, but in return on the international stage, China has supported Russian policy in Ukraine, and both of them are territorial rivals. Don't forget that in as late as 1969, Russia and China were fighting on their borders, nearly came to blows. Many strategists look at the simple fact that on one side of the border, on the Chinese side of the border, there are a lot of people. Cross the border to the Russian side, not many people at all, and think that's not stable long term, that sooner or later the Chinese will have territorial ambitions in Russia. And so nothing I'm saying here assumes a convergence of interest or a long-term alliance. I'm trying to compare and contrast these regime types. They're both capitalist authoritarian regimes within a globalized world, but I think they're not converging. They may be diverging. But they both have a strong converging interest for the moment in facing the U.S. liberal Leviathan, and they do not lack for soft power in the world. China is a major power in Africa, a growing power in Latin America, and we are well past a unipolar moment. We're in a multipolar world already, and for my money, that's just fine. But we need to understand what we're dealing with when we look at these regimes. I don't think, by the way, that we're moving towards a new Cold War for the simple reason that China and Russia both need an open international economy. And the critical point is that these authoritarian regimes would not last 5 minutes unless they were fully integrated into an international economy. They've tried autarky. There's nowhere else to go. They have to have Apple assembling iPhone 6s in China. Russia absolutely has to sell its gas in Europe. That means they have very, very strong reasons to contain and constrain their foreign policy. Let me just say, having said this, since it's December, 16th, 2014, that we are also celebrating the 100th anniversary of the First War, and alert members of this audience will think he's just said that economic interests always prevail over political disagreement, and we thought that was true in 1913 and plunged into a First World War. So let me introduce that caveat as well. I believe that China and Russia have such overwhelming interests in continuing open international economies that it will restrain their aggressive international behavior. I think it will also equally constrain American aggressive international behavior. But I'm also conscious that we said the same thing in 1912. So in this business, all guesses have to be approximate. Let me point out something else that may also be a signal of the place of China and Russia in the international system. If you ask the question, are they spoilers in the international system? Have they come to break up the international system? What's interesting, in fact, is how fully participant they are in the international system. Russia remains in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Almost everybody in this room, I think, will have forgotten, for example, that they're members of the European Court of Human Rights and accept its jurisdiction, and that 18,000 Russians, most of them in jail, write little petitions to Strasbourg trying to get themselves out of pokey. That's a sign of membership and belonging in the European Security Order. They actually pay for the European Court of Human Rights and are possibly more willing members of that great organization than many people in this island. But I won't go there. China remains in the UN human rights system, goes through the Universal Periodic Review. In other words, these are not regimes that, like Hitler or Stalin, came to break up the international order. They are occasionally spoilers, but mostly participants in the international order. They will veto, Russia and China will veto every effort to bring peace in Syria, but in the Central African Republic and the Congo, China is sending peacekeepers. So it's important to remember that their international behavior is quite complex, and it seems to me in the interest of geostrategic order to encourage their continued participation and reward their continued participation in multilateral institutions. Let me get, because I am coming to a conclusion and hope we have time for questions. How vulnerable are they? A number of years ago, we were very struck, I think everybody was impressed by their enormous decisional capacity. What struck me when I was in China is that in my country, Canada, we've taken 40 years to consider the question of whether we should have a high-speed train between Montreal and Toronto. 40 years. We've had reviews and decisions and this and that, and NIMBYism has won out, and we have not built the train. The Chinese built a fast bullet train between Beijing and Shanghai in about 18 months. So an important contrast between just how slow liberal democracies can be about key infrastructure investment compared to the Chinese. So they can make decisions very rapidly. They can allocate capital very quickly. They can steamroller over objections very quickly. So they're capable of rapid growth and fast decisions. But by and large, these are regimes that do not foster innovation. They're extremely vulnerable to corruption, and they're very brittle. If they don't control everything, they soon fear that they will control nothing. And this, it seems to me, means that finally their exposure to the international economy, which we're living through right at the moment, leads to very unpredictable results. There will be some of you in this audience, like me, who think, isn't it nice to watch Putin get his comeuppance and see the ruble crash? Do we really want an economically unstable authoritarian regime on the European frontier? There's some very complicated judgments here. I want anybody who's even remotely connected to the downing of MH17, as I believe Putin was, to pay very serious consequences for his willingness to hand those kind of weapons to those kind of people. And I want anybody who alters the borders of Europe by force to face serious consequences. But I don't think it's in anybody's interest to want this economy to go down, because the unpredictable consequences, not to mention the hardship of a wonderful people, the Russian people, are very difficult to predict the results of. So these are, I think, much more vulnerable regimes than we thought. Corruption risks eroding regime legitimacy. The middle class may simply decide to transfer in an open global economy, a worried and frightened middle class simply buys property in London, Vancouver, and Hong Kong and gets its accounts into dollars as quickly as it can. That, it seems to me, to give these regimes vulnerabilities that the previous totalitarian variants never had. If you then flip this around, and here I am beginning to work to my conclusion, if you look at a very different question, facing this authoritarian capitalism, what assets do we have? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? It seems to me liberal democracies are more effective than those regimes at containing, channeling, and responding to discontent, at opening up democratic debate on difficult questions. I don't want to step into the Scottish referendum debate, believe me, I don't, but it would serve, if you were a man from Mars looking at democracy's strength, at an extraordinary example of the resilience and capacity of democratic systems to have difficult debates about difficult subjects, whatever you think of the outcome. Anybody looking at democracy would think the Scottish referendum was a pretty good advertisement for the peaceful, civil debate of a fundamental existential question. And authoritarian systems do not have that capacity. That seems to me an extraordinarily important asset, and should make us value our democratic procedures more than we do. In addition, and I don't want to sound like a kind of ideologist here, but I do think there's something to be said for the claim that open societies are more innovative, that free media, free capital markets, free institutions make for innovation more successfully than authoritarian systems. The other point that people don't notice is that, and this is again a controversial issue in Europe, liberal democracies are countries of immigration, net in-migration. No one is migrating to China and Russia. I know how difficult and painful the immigration subject is in domestic debates in Europe, but I would have thought if you care about innovation, if you care about growth, you actually want more immigration, not less. And the facts of the enormous contribution of immigration to American economic growth just seems to me indisputable. And this is something those societies, they don't attract. They don't attract the best and the brightest. Our vulnerabilities are equally obvious to us. The openness, the transparency, the accountability that have the enormously positive side that we can talk about difficult questions together, simultaneously give too many interests effective veto power. We also have, I think, an ongoing fiscal crisis. The growth of entitlement since the Second World War is now very difficult to change and roll back. Our societies have a continual difficulty now in funding the public goods that are necessary for both justice, stability, and growth. I'm a passionate believer in public goods, and we have a ongoing, continual, and aggravating crisis in the provision of public goods. We have an inequality crisis, which we all know and feel, and in fact, some of that inequality has been hastened and made more serious, in fact, by the relentless dynamism of technological innovation. I'm just giving you a list of our problems so we're honest about where we are. We also have, and have had with growing seriousness since the IRA troubles in Britain and then since 9/11 in the States, a growing problem about a deep state. I've criticized Putin for being a creature of the deep state. Candor requires me to say we have a deep state, and we do not have it very well under control. And anybody who read last week's torture report in the United States can only feel not only horror at the abuses that were committed, but a sense that we have an archipelago underneath the ground of our democracy that is invisible to the democracy and essentially, or was, out of control. And these are just some of our vulnerabilities. So where do I conclude? I've mentioned our vulnerabilities so that you don't hear this as describing a present danger that requires the marshalling of a new Cold War and an aggressive ideological defense of liberal democracy. On the contrary, it seems to me my motto here is the Voltairean, il faut cultiver notre jardin. Now, we've got problems that we need to fix here. I would just remind you of a poem that you probably know by Constantin Cavafy, wonderful poet, wrote a famous poem that you probably know called Waiting for the Barbarians. And the final line of Waiting for the Barbarians could, I suppose, serve as the kind of mocking epitaph. Look at the possibility that the 20th century will be defined by an authoritarian alternative to liberal democracy. One of the temptations is to make them into an enemy. And I think it's extremely important to remember, again, the philosophical distinction and the practical political distinction between an enemy and an adversary. Seems to me we're looking at an adversary but not an enemy. And a lot of geopolitics depends on holding very firmly to the distinction between an enemy and an adversary. There are aspects of these societies that are repugnant to me, but I've tried to emphasize the degree to which there are aspects of our own societies that deeply need correction and improvement. We are faced with a competition, hopefully a peaceful one, between two ways of getting through the 21st century, two ways of managing and dealing with the tensions and conflicts of modernity. And it's absolutely crucial that we maintain an adversarial relationship with these people and not the relationship of an enemy. Because we do not want, and it was one of the things that I lived through in the Cold War, we do not want to have the ideological self-congratulation that got us through the Cold War to obscure and darken from our own eyes our need for liberal democratic reform here at home. So I thank you for your attention. Sorry to have gone on quite so long. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So we now have an opportunity for questions to be put. There are one or two practicalities. If I could ask if you could please put up your hands to indicate if you wish to ask a question, and wait until the microphone has reached you. And if you could also hold it clearly to your mouth, and keep the questions short and to the point. So are there any questions? So if we start perhaps down here, and then just to keep a little bit of a track, and then we'll pass to this gentleman here. And did I see somebody? Yes, over there on that side. Thank you very much.
Yeah, your talk reminded me of that old comparison that gangsterism is a form of capitalism, special form. One thinks of the mafiosi. And in that respect, what you're saying is that we have two large gangster states. And I wonder whether the same comparison is how does one counter the mafiosi? I mean, in southern Italy and Sicily, they're having to do that. And I wonder if there's a model there for how the people in those states are going to have to counter this gangsterism.
Mm-hmm. I think in the interest of maximizing participation, if I could take a few questions, and I will try to answer maybe 3 of them in one go.
Hi, my name is Ian Ritchie. I'm a Vice President here at the Royal Society. Absolutely fascinating. I mean, just fascinating coverage of the subject. The one thing that you said, though, that, I'm slightly puzzled by. You said about how liberal democracies refresh themselves, and they clear out the rascals and bring in new rascals and so forth. And these authoritarian capitalisms don't do that. But China and Russia are not the same. I mean, Russia is a kleptocracy. And that sort of corruption I think, is going to continue. At least in China, every 10 years, there's a new leadership comes through. And somehow or other, these new leaders seem to revolutionize the thought and cleanse in a different sort of way. Have you thought about how, I don't know how that happens, but how do, somebody like Xi has been, in the system for 40, 50 years, and yet he comes out and he wants to change it. And that's strange that they should do that.
Yeah.
Thank you. The film Leviathan, which has been apparently enjoying great success in Moscow as well as Western capitals this autumn, is quite explicit in its denunciation of the corruption in the Soviet state, the absolute corruption. So, given that it was endorsed by the Ministry of Culture, do we view this as some extraordinary bureaucratic oversight, or is it possibly the beginning of a second or third Russian Revolution?
Let's take a couple more before you respond. Could we? There's a lady at the back, and also, can you just keep your hands up so I can have sight of where? Before you speak, can I just keep a sight of if we could have this lady down at the front? So please, the lady at the back, yes.
Dr. Milja Radovic, thank you very much, Professor Ignatieff. I would like to ask you, to which extent do you think that authoritarian capitalism of China and Russia informed and enriched neoliberal capitalism in the West? And could you tell us more, perhaps, about the Western Hemisphere? And do you observe capitalism in the West as Potemkin's villages? And also a little comment about free media and free press. I think that's very problematic in this hemisphere as well. And I personally feel about British and US media and global media, precisely as you said, you pretend to tell us truth, and I pretend to believe you.
And then just the one, yes, down here, and then we'll have some response. So you have the microphone, yes, sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about how fledgling liberal democracies in places like Africa, like Botswana and Ghana, how they can kind of stand up to this, or I don't know if that's the right terminology, but how they can resist this authoritarian capitalism from China in particular.
Let me go backwards. They're all excellent questions. Let me start with a question from the front. I think it's a matter of real rejoicing that Botswana and Ghana have consolidated and maintained democratic alternation. My concern in Africa is that this kind of authoritarian capitalism is only too attractive to predatory, resource-dependent elites. I mean, it just is perfect for them, and you go to Angola, these frightful regimes that have been, spending more money on medevac for the children of the elite than they do for the entire primary health budget of 55 million people. I mean, authoritarian capitalism looks great for these guys. I would not underestimate the soft power appeal of this kind of stuff. That would be my first point. And the only solution is simply the successful consolidation of democratic capitalism in places like, and democratic liberty in places like Ghana and in other African states. I'm actually quite optimistic about Africa, but this really is getting, if Ghana gets it right, then other countries can, and bit by bit we get more democratic regimes stabilizing, and there's not much that outsiders can do, although we need to help. As for the lady at the back invited me to be talk about the Potemkin freedoms of the West. Yes, nobody's shooting journalists with silencers. Yes, we have the modern media is a kind of house of mirrors, and we all are highly adept as democratic citizens in trying to decode how much truth we're hearing. I don't want to overstate how wonderful the media is, especially not because I used to be in it and know all the kind of tricks we used to get up to. But I just think, honest to God, there's no real comparison between the highly managed media of China and Russia and the media we have here. Yes, we have problems with single ownership. We've had lots of experience with the Murdoch press, which has left us all concerned about our freedom. But on balance, I think that when I look at the stubborn courage with which American journalists and law professors uncovered the torture state in the United States, just as an example, that looks to me like a democratic free press doing its job, and also a democratic academy doing its job. And as I said in relation to Russia, I want to make it very clear that some of the journalists in the world I most admire are the Russian journalists who have uncovered the corruption of the Putin regime. We would only know what a kleptocrat he was thanks to the incredibly courageous media of a free Russia. So that's that. As for Leviathan, I've not seen Leviathan, and I can't understand why it's got out there. Authoritarian societies may well flirt with anti-corruption campaigns. I mean, these are very complicated, sophisticated systems of control. It may help a regime at a certain moment to reveal or punish corruption, or to allow a film out that describes it, provided lots of other stuff is hidden. It seems to me compatible with the rather sophisticated model of authoritarian capitalist control I was describing. The second question about political alternation in China I thought was very well taken. Part of what I think gives Xi Jinping's regime and the Chinese regime in general its legitimacy is these successful transitions in which, they march out a whole new team and everybody goes, oh, he's number one, he's number two, he's number four, and we didn't expect. It connects to what I said about meritocracy. There's a very strongly ideological claim that these are the best and brightest. You don't get to choose, we get to choose, but we choose for your benefit. And I don't think this is all just false and show. If you allow a little story from my political life, I had a long interview with two members of the previous Politburo, and I did come away thinking, kind of pound for pound, minute for minute, this was the most competent elite I'd ever spent quality time with. I mean, just for sheer, brain power, and also for their very significant freedom from ideological rhetoric and gueule du bois, as the French say. Because I remember meeting the Soviet elites in the late 80s, and they were just in fantasy land. Whereas if you talk to the Chinese Politburo and you edge in that kind of Canadian, moderate, slightly apologetic way, you do have a little bit of problem with pollution. I'm wondering whether you could talk about it. Say, pollution? My kids won't leave me alone. They're screaming at me. They can't breathe the air. They're going to have to emigrate because it's so bad. And let me tell you about another problem. We got no healthcare system. We got no public insurance system. We need all the help we can get. I mean, on and on and on. You only do that if you're very confident, you master of your dossier. I'm not saying these guys aren't sophisticated. And they have succeeded in understanding that transition is key to legitimacy. And Putin has a problem here. He has no transition mechanism. He has no succession. And that, I think, is part of the brittleness that makes him possibly vulnerable. As for the gangster states, I thought I think liberal democracies also struggle with gangsterism, and we can learn a lot from, for example, Italy's struggle against gangsterism. Some of the great heroes of European democracy since the Second World War have been the judges of Italy who've indicted criminals, who've been assassinated for indicting criminals. Some of the heroes of Italian democracy are the cops who've arrested them and put them in jail. The key here in all of these cases is rule of law. You have a gangster state if you have rule by law and you have the rule of the permanent exception. And the key battle, I think, actually to stabilize these regimes, or the key contradiction for these regimes, the reason why their stabilization is difficult, the reason why it's impossible to predict that authoritarian capitalism is stable, is that they don't have rule of law. That is, they do not have independent counter power to power. They do not have constitutionalized rights. They do not have one law for everybody, and they do not have judicial review. And as long as they don't have that, there is some fundamental insecurity in their property regimes. And as long as there's fundamental instability in their property regimes, you're going to have a discontented middle class because they're not sure that their holdings are secure. And so this is, I think, the battle. That's why when Xi Jinping, who's, as you suspect, immensely able, says the key priority of my regime is corruption and the socialist rule of law, a lot turns on what he means by socialism, and a lot turns on what he means by the word of. You know, they've got socialist rule by law, which is essentially rule by administrative fiat. Can they begin to develop an independent judiciary to guarantee the holdings of their middle class? That seems to me is the key question as to whether they move beyond being a gangster state. I'm much more pessimistic that that will happen in Russia than I am in China.
Do we have to be out exactly by 7:30, or can we? Sorry. Yeah, yes, I'm sorry. We'll take 2 or 3 more questions, if we may. Sorry. If we could have just adjacent there, and then if we could come across here to Stuart Sutherland, who's there, and then there's a gentleman at the back also there. Thank you. So please, go ahead.
Would you care to comment that some are saying that Protestant Christianity may do it for the regime in China?
Let's gather these up and then you can. I'm sorry. Yes, that's fine.
Stuart Sutherland, you used the expression open society fairly well on in your talk, for which thank you very much. I mean, I thought the talk was so stimulating. But you used that expression, which immediately brings to mind Karl Popper. And of course, he tried to resolve some of these conflicts by aligning political freedom with the freedom of the mind in scientific method and research. And the tie-on is how far these economies require advanced technology based on scientific research that therefore will bust them. I mean, I think Solzhenitsyn dealt with this in The First Circle, for example.
Thank you. at the back, and then I think we'll just, if this can be brief. No, you're pleased, but then we'll just take one short question after this. Thank you.
Very, very interesting talk. And what I'm interested, how much time liberal democracies can provide to this authoritarian capitalism, which, as you know, it's only 20 or 30 years time, and how much transition you give him in a situation when geopolitics of the United States particularly encircle them, and you know that and Russian and Chinese are genetically different, so that their transition to the liberal democracy will be different.
And if we could just down here in the second row, this lady here, just 3 in. Thank you very much.
Just being Russian myself, I was listening with a great interest to what you were talking about. And what is interesting is I discussed and disputed Putin many times with Russian people of different generations. And what wasn't highlighted I noticed the attitude of ordinary people towards towards Putin, because many Russian people do like Putin, do admire him, and do stand for him. So it is phenomenal, it's interesting. From one point of view, people feel oppressed. From the other hand, they just admire Putin, and they have probably strong reasons for that.
Again, great questions. How much time, I'm going to number 3, how much time, I think what's very unclear is whether these regimes will transition more closely towards a rule of law authoritarianism, if that's not a total contradiction in terms, or whether they'll harden up in the face of the contradictions that I've described. If socialist rule of law then begins to consolidate itself in such a way that ordinary non-members of the party think that when they go in front of a Communist Party judge, they'll get justice, that regime will stabilize long-term and get through the 21st century just fine, and I don't think it will converge towards liberal democracy. I want to repeat, Herzen's line about history not having a libretto. It doesn't have a libretto. There's no reason why the world should become like us at all. It'll become very different. But if the regime feels that its interests are endangered by independent free institutions, and it decides to double down and tighten up, I think we'll have a much more unstable China through the 21st century. So that's just on that. The open society question, I'm very grateful for Lord Sutherland's point, because I did not speak about freedom of the mind. I talked only about rule of law and property. And one of the puzzles is whether you can have innovation in an authoritarian society unless you have complete freedom of scientific inquiry, and not just in the hard science, but also in the social sciences, in anthropology, in sociology, in political, in all the politically sensitive ones. My sense is when I see Chinese colleagues that they're living on that fault line. I'm sure the University of Edinburgh and St. Andrews and the great universities of this place experience what I experience, is you constantly meet these Chinese social scientists or political scientists, you don't quite know what you're dealing with. I mean, it's not that they aren't smart and able and very well read in Western stuff, but you don't quite know whether they're kind of kosher, as it were. It's a little different with some of the hard scientists, but clearly, if I'm saying, as I've been saying, that one of the vulnerabilities of authoritarian societies, they're not terribly good at innovation. One of the reasons that they may not be terribly good at innovation, that they cannot afford the freedom that Karl Popper is evoking in the Open Society. And I think I ought to both say more and study more about that issue because it seems to me terribly important. I put all the emphasis on law, the rule of law, really. The Protestant Christianity thing I think is actually extremely interesting. You're obviously citing the fact that the most explosive growth of confessional adherence in China is from Protestant evangelical groups. And there's always been a Protestantism in China for a very, very long time. They may become vulnerable to certain kinds of jingoistic nationalism. I mean, a phony attempt to describe Protestantism as an alien Western treacherous implant. But I have sufficient respect for the benefits and virtues and importance of religious consolation to think that an authoritarian regime would be very foolish to underestimate the staying power of Protestantism in China. I don't think it represents a regime threat unless the regime is stupid enough to try and stamp it out. And then look out.
They're destroying churches right now.
Well, this just depends how far you... one of Isaiah Berlin's favorite metaphors was the metaphor of the bent twig. You can push that twig only so far, and then it snaps back. And I think further persecution may have the twig snap back in their faces. I wouldn't underestimate the power of confessional belief to resist tyranny, and anybody who thinks religion can't make a stand against authoritarianism doesn't know very much about the history of religion. Finally, about Putin, yes, lots of people admire Putin. And I think the honorable reason to admire Putin is that he restored their pride. The 90s were very tough for Russia. It's very tough to lose an empire. It was the last European empire, the last one. You know, we thought with the end of the Portuguese Empire in 1974, that was the end of European imperialism. It wasn't. The end of European imperialism was 1991, and it's tough to lose an empire. The British have had to go through it, the Belgians have had to go through it, the Dutch have gone through it, the Portuguese have gone through it. Life is a lot better when you do without an empire. But in the transition, as you get out of an empire, you got to tell people you're still great, you're still terrific, you're still fantastic, and if you can take off your shirt and strut around, so much the better. And, you know, I mean, it's all kind of machismo and all that stuff, and it cues into the most kind of disreputable aspect of the Russian political tradition. This is said with feeling as someone whose father was born in Russia and loves Russia, but the kind of, you know, relentless, you know, humorless machismo of their political tradition is pretty nauseating, and they got to wake up and vote for somebody who doesn't win your affection by stripping down to your shorts, you know. Anyway, that's enough nonsense from me. I think we better call it a night before I enrage you still further. Thank you very much for your attention.
With that unsettling image fixed in your mind, I'm now going to invite Professor Alexander to give a vote of thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, earlier this year, on behalf of the RSC, I visited Beijing for the first time as part of a continuing program of links with Chinese national academies. And if I can just, an aside, Michael, I spent 2 days with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And as I left the last session, I was scratching my head in the same way as you've just described and wondering what social science actually meant in that kind of society. So it's something I think we need to come to grips with. Unfortunately for me, the visit was too short to allow me to form anything but the most superficial impression of a country which is trying, as we've heard tonight, to combine a Western-style economic miracle with the continuation of a non-democratic one-party state. As I looked around the city of Beijing, I was aware, if I mentally edited the Chinese characters from my field of vision, that I could have been in any major international city. Berlin, Sydney, Chicago, Boston, Toronto. That, I thought, was globalization. But It was an attempt to have globalization in one country, if I can put it that way. It's tempting, but as Professor Ignatieff has eloquently demonstrated, both erroneous and incomplete, simply to dismiss China as a sort of organized hypocrisy. The notion of trying to come to terms with a divided freedom seems to me to be much more elegant and much more productive in trying to understand what's going on there. And I suppose the same conclusion would apply to today's Russia. I visited Russia for the first time about 5 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there was still a commitment to a form of democracy that we might recognize as such. Indeed, one of the most moving experiences of my visit was to be taken to a polling station so that I could witness the lines of people waiting to cast their votes in the second round of a genuinely competitive presidential election. How things have changed in 15, 20 years since. I mention these two personal experiences simply to emphasize how much we need to understand the political and economic changes in single countries, especially perhaps single superpowers, in the context of how the world has so rapidly changed in our lifetime. I think, ladies and gentlemen, this evening we've heard a splendid lecture, learned, topical, and immensely thought-provoking. And it's a great pleasure to propose this vote of thanks to Professor Ignatieff. In doing so, Michael, I can't resist channeling the great journalist and commentator for whom your Harvard chair is named by saying good night and good luck, and thank you for a wonderful lecture.